This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way.
I've been doing a lot of cooking lately, partly out of necessity, partly out of preference in my own life. But part of it is that, have you seen what is happening at like restaurants right now? You know how much it costs to take a family of 5 out for dinner these days? In reality, it's like, we can do this once in a while when we get the free Russ's coupons, or we go to Chick-fil-A on Tuesday nights when kids are free, or something like that. But I don't know what kind of family you grew up in, but I grew up in a family where when it came to cooking, oftentimes the recipes went something like this, and maybe you can relate to it. It's like, well, here's the recipe. If I remember right, it's you take a little bit of this and you throw in some more of this stuff and a dash of that, and you sprinkle some of this stuff, and then you mix it together. That's about how the recipe goes. And then, okay, so what am I supposed to, well, cook it for about this much time, and if that's not enough, then cook it for maybe this much time. And that's oftentimes how the recipes got passed down in our family. And the reality is that means that there's a lot of trial and error involved when it comes to cooking our family recipes, which means it might be great, and you might have to be ordering takeout or something like that as things go. But I am kind of an experimenter in the kitchen, if you will. It drives my wife nuts sometimes. But the beauty is sometimes when you take a recipe like that, maybe you can even improve it or make it better. Like my mom's my favorite meal growing up was meatloaf. And she gave the meatloaf recipe to my wife, which was literally, well, if I remember right, it's some of this and it's a little bit more of this, and you put it all together and you cook it for about this much time, and hopefully it works out right. And a little while ago, my wife made my mom's famous meatloaf for the first time, and I looked at her and said, this is the best meatloaf I've ever had. So sometimes it works out like that. But when it comes to the kitchen and cooking, oftentimes maybe you buy something that's got a box and a recipe on it, and you kind of know what to expect. But the best recipes, the best restaurants, the best chefs in the world know that the best food takes some trial and error, some experimenting, some taking some risks, you will. Maybe even doing some things with things you didn't even think could be eaten or whatever. And they oftentimes get a reputation as these innovators, these risk takers, these people that are pursuing excellence in that way. And before we jump into Acts this morning, we're continuing on in this series called The Way. I just want to let you know that we have a family legacy like that here at Venture as well. Over 20 years ago, a few people took this risk to start a church in town called The Journey that would be for the outsiders, the people that feel like they don't belong in other churches, but the people that still want to take some steps in relationship with God. And then about 10 years into that journey, there was a campus that was born up here on the north side. And we've been growing out of that, and a year ago we pivoted on our own, but in collaboration with The Journey, to Venture as well. One of the phrases that's been around forever is that everything is an experiment. In the DNA of The Journey, and now in Venture's DNA, is this reality that we are going to try, and we're going to experiment, and we're going to take risks, because we want to do anything we can to reach people in our community that might feel like they are too far away, made too many mistakes in their life, maybe the misfits, whatever that looks like, to find this relationship with a loving God in their own lives. And so I just want to let you know, like, if you're looking for a place that is just comfortable, where the music you hear every Sunday is your favorite music, if the messages that you hear are mostly just confirming what you already believe about the world, it just probably isn't the right place for you. There are great churches in this town that maybe take a little bit more conservative approach to how they do things. But Venture Church is for risk takers. Like I think about what we did a year ago to pivot on our own. Like we're part of a good church organization. There's a good staff team. The finances are in place. The facilities are in place. Like why pivot? Why go? Why take that risk? Well, part of it is because we were dreaming of what we could do that would be more for our city, for our community. And we didn't want just a limit on our campus model, but how do we move to something that could grow beyond that in a collaborating church model? So now instead of one church and two locations, we have a new church plant. We got this church up here in town, and we continue to dream of more. Venture's not just content saying, how do we just kind of keep the lights on in this facility and keep the same people in place and make sure that everything's comfortable on a Sunday? We're saying, God, what do you maybe want from us in the next decade? Do you want us to be part of sending out another team of people to start another church, maybe in a different part of our community? How do you want us to grow our partnerships around the world? Do you want us to send people out to be part of that? And I think about just what we've seen in this past year. A little over a year ago, Ayana, our kids director, came to me and she said, hey, I'd really like to evaluate some things. We've been operating the same curriculum for a few years now. I'd like to try something new. I said, go for it. And so we made a change in our kids' curriculum that she's been leading. We got such good feedback from our kids and our families and our volunteers that talk about the stickiness of the curriculum that she's using. And she continues to dream. For the first time, we're planning a Venture Kids Day Camp this summer, and we want to go beyond that as well. So we've taken some risks in what we're doing in Venture Kids. Think about Alpha. We've been running Alpha for a few years now, and we said this spring, we said, what does it look like for us to move Alpha outside of our own building into the city and try to get some other people to collaborate with us? And so now we're a few weeks into Alpha. There are 4 different churches helping make this one happen, but the truth is most of the people that are participating in this current Alpha probably have little to no actual church affiliation. And it's just kind of so cool to see what's happening right in the heart of Muskegon through Alpha as we're making this kind of risky decision. Let's try something else. Aaron, who's leading our band on a weekly basis, he's a creative and an artist and a musician and all these things, and he has his own idea of saying, I want to try some things with the way that we do music and some of the songs we play. You even heard some of that this morning, blending both newer and older things together. Go for it, Aaron. Let's take some risks as we go. And the list goes on and on. This summer, we're dreaming of Venture Camp. The first time we've ever even tried, we have no idea how this is going to go. I think it's going to be the best weekend of the summer, to be honest. But we're so excited to say, what does it look like for us to go and pause from the busyness of life to enjoy some fellowship, some creation together, and also make room for some of our friends, some of our neighbors that might not be interested in trying the Sunday thing, but might get away to camp with us. We're going to see what happens in the months and weeks ahead. But that's what we are. We're a church for risk takers. I even think I'm so grateful for Lindsay and Ayana speaking last week. I know for most people, like the biggest risk they'll ever take in their life is standing on a stage in front of others. If you've never done it before, it can be intimidating. But I see the way that they have grown and they're willing to take a risk. I even think about Lindsay's own story. I think sometimes we live our lives longing for sort of purpose and identity and saying, God, when will you show me why I'm here? But I think we maybe mistake it thinking we're just going to live our life, go through our normal routines, do the same thing each and every day, and just some sort of light bulb is going to go off, or we're going to get struck by lightning, or a genie's going to pop up, and all of a sudden everything's going to be clear. Oftentimes we live into our calling, our purpose, through small steps of faithfulness. And Lindsay's own story, taking some steps in faithfulness and serving in the kids area and then growing in her own faith, reading the Bible, serving more to the point where she's now on our leadership team at Venture, making some of the critical decisions with our team along the way, and now preaching. And I just love the fact that we've got like a stable of preachers coming up through the ranks here at Venture. We want to continue to be a church that takes risks and encourage people to take steps of faith that might seem scary, uncomfortable, risky, any of that. And this morning we're going to jump into Acts chapter 18. And the truth is, this is one of the chapters in Acts that it's kind of easy to gloss over and sort of like, I don't really even know what to take. I'll explain that in just a second. But one of the things that I want to highlight before we jump in to these verses is that we are entering, or we're in the middle of an election cycle, right? Who's pumped? Everybody's like no. 2 thumbs down, I think, across the board. How do we deal with an election cycle as a church community? How do we encourage people towards being more like Jesus in a world that's increasingly divided? How do we look at the political parties and say there is definitely not a right camp to be in? They are both equally flawed and misguided on so many different ways. Well, here's how we're going to handle this. If you read through the New Testament of the Bible, how many of the emperors, the governors, the generals, the CEOs of the Roman Empire are listed in the New Testament? I don't know. The answer is a few, but they are mentioned. There is nothing talking about their deeds, really, their biographies, their contribution to the world. And yet, 2,000 years after Jesus walked this planet, he is the most famous person in history. And oftentimes we get captivated by the news headlines of these people that seem so influential and famous and important, but really they all go down as footnotes in history. And there's one kingdom that endures, and there's one kingdom that perseveres, and that's the kingdom of heaven, introduced by the inbreaking of the Son of God and the person of Jesus into this world. And that's what we're pursuing. And as we jump into Acts chapter 18, we realize the same thing, that Paul was a man that was surrendered to the ways of Jesus. And because of that, his name was lifted up, but not because he was a great man or a famous man. He was just passionately pursuing the ways of Jesus in the world around him. And so this is what it says in Acts chapter 18. And one of the things we just want to kind of focus on is actually from Matthew 24. It says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jesus is saying there's one thing that will endure, and we want to set our sights on what matters most. And so it says this in Acts chapter 18 as we continue on. It says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome, Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. And in some ways we could say this is how Acts 18 and even a couple of the chapters that follow kind of go. It's like, well, Paul got up, he went to this place, he met some people, he went to the synagogue and he preached, and then he moved on. And that's a little bit of the story, and that's why it's a little bit easy to sort of gloss over it. Because you're like, well, Paul went to this new place, he preached the message, some people believed, some didn't, and he moved on. But what it says a few verses later in verse 9, it says this, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in the city. So Paul stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years, teaching them the word of God. So one of the things we see in the book of Acts is people's lives are transformed by this good news of Jesus. They're sharing it with the community around them. They find some people that are hostile towards them. They find adversity along the way. Sometimes they suffer along the way. But God's promise is that he will be faithful to them in the long run. And I think sometimes we read the book of Acts and you see all these incredible things happen. There are miracles happening where people are being healed and being rescued and being saved. And the good news of Jesus is spreading from a small group of people out to the ends of the earth. And people are going on these grand adventures sharing these things. And people from all backgrounds and all kinds of walks of life, their lives are being changed. It's like, man, why aren't we seeing that today? But oftentimes because we see a very condensed snapshot of what was happening in the early church. Because the book of Acts isn't written over a few weeks or months or even years. It's written describing the course of about 3 decades of the work of the Holy Spirit in the lives of those first followers of Jesus. And specifically when we think about Paul, we think about some of the stories about Paul and the way that he preached and the way that people came to faith. But we see that he had camped out in Corinth for 18 months or longer than that. So when I talk about being a church of risk takers, one of the things I want you to know is it's not about instant results or instant success. It's about faithfulness through and through. Faithfulness in the days and the weeks and the months and the years that are ahead of us. Because one of the things we see in this middle section of Acts chapter 18 is God says, don't give up. Don't quit speaking. I am with you. And Paul stayed faithful to what God was calling him to in that moment. For 18 months or longer, Paul kept on preaching. And I want us to pursue long-term faithfulness over short-term acceptance. I think sometimes it's easy to say, what do people want to hear? What's going to get the least pushback? What do my friends want me to say? And sometimes we want to just be liked in the moment. We don't want to ruffle any feathers, but more than that, we want to pursue long-term faithfulness as a church, not just a church, as individuals. Say, God, how would you help me be steadfast in what you've called me into my own workplace, into my own family, my own neighborhood, my own school? God, even if it's hard, even if people oppose me, what does it look like for me to be faithful through a lifetime pursuing you? And one of the things I think we see is at the end of Acts chapter 18. It says this starting in verse 24. It says, meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately. Though he knew only the baptism of John, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. There's this term in the Christian faith that's oftentimes, I think, misunderstood and misused, but the term is discipleship. It means something like apprenticeship. What does it look like to actually not just believe in Jesus, but follow the ways of Jesus on a daily basis? What is it like for people to interact with you and them to think that they are interacting with somebody whose life really has been changed by Jesus, that is different in this world? And it's hard because, to be honest, discipleship does not happen best from me lecturing you from stage. And discipleship does not happen best by you watching some YouTube videos about how to know the Bible better or something like that. Discipleship happens best in relationship with others, pursuing relationship with Jesus, learning from him and listening and following him day in and day out in your own life. Well, Paul camped out for 18 months in Corinth, and there were these couple people, Aquila and Priscilla. He said, I'm alongside you. And he lived his life alongside them as well. And somewhere along the way, another man came. He had some education, but he still needed to grow in understanding about what it meant to follow Jesus as well. He said, hey, come with us. And they taught him the ways of Jesus in their own lives as well. And so I can think about maybe if you're in Paul's situation, or maybe if we just go to our own kind of timeline in our own world that's sort of instant gratification, quick fix to everything. We show up to Corinth, we hang out there for a few days, and if everything doesn't change in the moment, we're like, I'm moving on. And yet Paul, even though he experienced some hostility, some adversity. He listened to God, the God that says, I will be faithful to you. And he stuck there for a year and a half or longer. And part of the fruit of that is to seeing the people that he was investing in, then investing in others. Life change can have a trickle-down effect. That when I'm growing, I can encourage others, and they might encourage others as well. And that's where I think we sometimes confuse our short-term goals for God's long-term plans. It happens all the time. It happens a lot in our world right now, where we think we have to go faster, go bigger, go better. And yet the story of the Jesus who is transforming lives in the book of Acts is the story of a God who's intentional, who's sometimes slow, and a God who continues to be faithful to what he's called his people towards. We're wrapping up this we're in the final few months of our first year existence as a church that calls itself a church for risk takers, that we don't want to just settle and get comfortable. And maybe you say, maybe we haven't gone fast enough, big enough, far enough yet. Really what God is calling us is not to success, but to faithfulness in the middle of that. That's why I'm really excited when I think about what I've seen over the last year. We want to make sure as Venture begins that we get the right foundation in place, that we understand that it's not about any personality, it's just about the person of Christ through and through. That it's not just about a certain program or pet project that we're going to have. It's what are we doing to invite others to explore and to follow Jesus, no matter how distant they may feel away. What does it look like for us at church to say, how do we have our hands in together? Finances, serving, connecting with our community to say it's not just about a few people, it's about us all doing it together. How do we have the right people in place to say they're humble and they're servant leaders and they love Jesus more than they love anything else, and to trust them in the middle of all that? I love what I'm seeing in our foundation in this first year. And we can trust in this. Deuteronomy 7:9 says, know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. It's a promise that he's living out even to this day. It started in the Old Testament promises to Abraham, to Moses, to David and beyond. It came in the New Testament in Jesus and those first disciples, those first followers of Jesus in the book of Acts. And we continue to see it today. That God is faithful to his promises to bless and provide and to love and to invite anyone, no matter background, into new life in him. And Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. The promise is that Jesus is unchanging. He is good and he's faithful and he's loving and he's inviting each of us into relationship with himself. So we can understand that since God is always faithful, we can strive to be faithful in all things as well. What we're measured by is not our success, it's our faithfulness. Everything's an experiment. But we're going to be willing to take risks to say our calling is to share this hope of Jesus with the world around us. It's not just for us that we may sit and dwell in it and be comfortable, but instead, how do we wrestle with the burden that is a world that is lost and hurting? And what will we do? What will we risk to reach them with this hope that we may see? You can read Acts chapter 18 and you can kind of read it such as, well, Paul went here and he preached this and some people believed and some people didn't and he moved on. And Paul went here and he preached this and some people believed and some people didn't and he moved on. That's a way that you can read Acts chapter 18. But I think when we pull back the lens a little bit, it's it's an encouragement and an invitation to us to always be faithful. Just like Paul was in the midst of adversity, to be faithful to what God has called us to, but also to trust in a God that is always faithful. That at the end of the day, he's the one that changes lives. He's the one that changes hearts. He's asked us to be part of his mission. But he's just asked us to be faithful to what he's called us to right here and right now. And here's the last thing I'll say about that. If I can go back to cooking. I said part of it was a necessity thing, right? Busy schedule, increasing costs, like we got to figure out how to make this happen. My wife's recovery and stuff like that. I've been cooking partly out of necessity, but there's also been a preference thing about that. And if I'm just really honest with you, I'm 38 years old, and I realize at this age, if I don't make some changes to my own sort of health and lifestyle, there's going to be significant ramifications in the not too distant future. For my own life, I think I have a lot in common with a lot of people in our world. And at the end of last year, I had a few friends invite me to just start working out at the gym with them. Guess what? Not my favorite thing in the world. And when it comes to the gym, I will look for any excuse I can to get out of it, and I will show up late. Just like people treat church, I guess. But I've had these friends come alongside me, and what I can tell you is I'm not a gym rat. I am not the best or the most motivated, but just through some steady change and some steady progress and some faithful friendships, I am seeing change, and I'm seeing growth, and I'm feeling better, and I'm more encouraged. And so the food part of that preference is I've had some people in my own life say, hey, we want to help you with that as well. We want to help you figure out a diet. And I don't mean a diet like giving up something, just a healthy way to live. They'll be better for you. Come alongside me and some accountability. Because I realize I don't want to keep living the way I have always lived my own life. And I say that because when it comes to faithfulness, you're human and I'm human, and we just can't do it on our own. We're not strong enough, good enough. Talk to somebody that's in AA. Talk to them about what it was like to try to get sober on their own. We're just not as strong as we think we are. But together we can see real change happen. And so I say that as an encouragement to you. We've been running venture groups here for almost a year now, and we have some that are taking off and thriving. We have some that are still growing, but we have more people that need to engage on a regular basis in relationships that are intentional. And maybe the only question that you need in a group is, how can we encourage each other to stay faithful? You're not responsible for the success. You're responsible for your faithfulness. And you need other people alongside you to pray and encourage and pick you up. And we see that in Paul's life, that he had Aquila and Priscilla. He had Silas, he had Barnabas, he had these different people that he journeyed with through life so that they could encourage and share this together. We're going to continue to be a church of risk takers. We're going to try things. Say, God, we want to do whatever it takes to try to reach more people in our community with the hope that we have, that Jesus died and he rose again so that we may all experience new life. God, would you bless us along the way? Would you help us be faithful along the way to that? Would you pray with me? God, I think sometimes we read these snapshots of the stories that you were doing in the lives of the first followers in Acts, and it can be intimidating. Say, how is that possible? And when we pull back a little bit, we see that these were incredible things that you were doing in people's lives, but they weren't over the course of days or weeks. They were over the course of years and decades of faithfulness. That communities and families and nations can be changed as people pursue your ways, trusting that you are the God who's faithful, that you're the one who's working, that you are the only famous one throughout history, and that really there's one kingdom that reigns forever and ever, and it's yours. God, would you help us stay faithful? Would you help us continue to be humble as we pursue the ways of Jesus right here at Venture and in our community? God, we love you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.